Hello everybody, Brandon here. Welcome back to a new video. Today we are starting a new series, and this is a very special series to me because I've always wanted to look more at older games. Not just older games, but I wanted the excuse to look more at master games or some of the more interesting games from many years prior. And by doing that, I thought, hey, why not share some of them with you all? And in this series, I would like to show you my favorite game, what I believe is the game of the year from as many years as I can find. So we're starting with 2000. Is there a particular reason? Not quite. I thought 2000's, a good way to start. We'll go from 2000 up to modern times, and then we'll go even further back. And by the time the playlist is kind of filled up, it will be in order. So it'll start at like maybe 1800 or whenever the first games are in there, and move forward. So, all right. And game number one was fascinating to me. It's Peter Svidler versus Michael Adams, of course, in the year 2000. And Svidler is playing with the white side against Adams and plays such a strange combination that I found fascinating. And this whole game is extremely interesting and has a bunch of insights and things that I think are just super important. So let's get into it, shall we? All right. So we see e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. So we're getting into a Roy Lopez. And hey, if it's a game of the year and a Roy Lopez, you can expect some sort of interesting attack and some, interesting maneuvers along the way. And that's exactly what happens here. So a6, bishop to a4, knight to f6, and castles. So this is potentially an open or a closed or even something else, depending on what's played here. So knight takes e4 would go into the open. Playing something like bishop to e7 is more of a closed. And bishop to c5, which was played, is the classical or archangel-esque variation. So the idea of bishop c5 is, of course, the bishop is much more active on the a7 to g1 diagonal. That's one of the pros. But it doesn't mean that there's just pros and no cons. Otherwise, people would have been playing this and exclusively this for a long time. The problem with it is you never know if a move like bishop to g5 could be annoying at the right time. And also, it's uncertain whether or not the idea of c3 and d4 could be annoying as well, because now d4 comes with tempo hitting this bishop. So kind of like the Caro-Kann in a way, where the bishop is outside of the pawn chain compared to the French, and that's really nice, but sometimes it can be a target, and that's really annoying. So keeping those things in mind is actually really important when you're playing against these types of moves. So we see c3, which is kind of expected, because, hey, again, d4 is one of those nice moves you'd like to get in, especially since it comes with tempo now, attacking the bishop on c5 here. We see b5, and bishop to c2, which is really interesting. Most games have bishop to b3 in them, and there's an argument for both. So the idea of bishop to b3, of course, is to stay on the long diagonal, but the problem is it doesn't defend e4. So with playing bishop to c2, it's on a less active diagonal for the moment, but as we know, in the Roy Lopez, it's very common for this bishop to become amazing after some d4 and e5s. However, with the idea of bishop c2, there could be an idea of a faster d4. So that's one of the plans here. d6 was played, and now a4. a4 is generally one of those moves you see quite often in these Roy Lopez positions. It's potentially to artificially isolate this b5 pawn. Right now, there's actually a threat of taking it. For example, if black were to castle, this would be a colossal mistake after taking on b5, because there's no recapture since their rook on a8 is hanging. So here, bishop to g4 was played. Very natural move, of course, getting onto, or creating a pin, rather, on the f3 knight, which can be advantageous. There are other moves as well that do make sense. Bishop to b7 is something that I'm sure many of you have seen if you've played the Ruy Lopez. Same thing even with this move bishop d7 I've seen a few times, and mainly the purpose is again just making sure that this b5 pawn is covered. And one interesting note about bishop to d7 is that it actually could potentially protect b5 in the long run. So let's just say you want to play knight e7 to g6. So let's just say takes, just trade a bunch of things. Something like knight a3. Now, you don't have to move your queen to protect this b5 pawn. You could play something like knight to e7. There's actually some interesting uses of this move bishop d7, which originally can look quite passive. So bishop to g4 is also fine. There is an argument as well that it might be able to be kicked away with h3 g4 at an opportune moment. Surprisingly, these things are quite reasonable, and it's unclear whether or not this bishop might be a powerful piece creating a pin or a target in the future with h3. So d3 was actually played, and h3 is actually interesting to bring up immediately, because after bishop h5, again, there's arguments for g4, and there's also arguments for d3, which is pretty much the same move order and would transpose after castling. So d3, castles, and then h3, and bishop to h5. You don't really want to take, right? Because this kind of removes the tension. White has the bishop pair, and, well, if the position opens, then it's very clearly going to be better for white. Even if it's just a practical edge, just having that bishop pair here is extremely nice. So bishop to h5 was played. And now we see knight bd2, b4. So one thing to note about b4 is now it's essentially just saying, hey, I don't want a weak pawn on b5. I would rather have a weak pawn on a6, because eventually white might want to take and distract black's queen over to the a file. There are circumstances where this might be okay. And it's not also a silly idea to go like b4 and a5 as white, or even b4 and then taking on b5 to gain a lot of space. You see this a little bit in the Italian as well. So b4, and yeah, white doesn't really want to take. If white were to take, then all of a sudden they do weaken some important central squares. It is fair to say with this setup that white does have a little bit less space here, but there are some other advantages that come with it. So it's not just like, white gave up space in the opening and is worse. This is absolutely not true. White is totally fine, maybe a slight edge. So after, we see the move a5. And this is good because it fixes this pawn on a6. That's actually really important. For example, if you were to waste time with something like rook to e1, maybe a5 is worth a consideration. It might not be the best move, but it's still worth a consideration, because now if you ever take as well, then a knight can come to b4. And I'm not saying that this move is exactly what should be played right now, but playing this move a5 is just really nice because it also covers the b6 square. This is actually very common. And what you're doing is you're artificially isolating this b4 pawn, because who knows, maybe eventually you do actually just take it and hold on to it. This is possible. So rook to b8. And the next move I really, really like. And it's not one that you would immediately go out to say, hey, this looks like an amazing move, especially when you see the rest of this game. But it's queen e2. And the reason why I like queen e2, most people that play the Ruy Lopez might just play the move rook to e1 here, but this is a little uninspiring. The reason why I like queen e2 so much is, well, what's the purpose, right? It actually has a ton of them. And the first is that, of course, the rook on f1 does want to move, so you can move this knight from d2 to f1 to g3, and actually move this bishop out of the way, making it passive. That's one of the ideas. But also the other one is it's reserving time for the rook on f1. Maybe it wants to actually go to d1, maybe still e1, or maybe it wants to go to b1 and actually challenge the b rook on the b file, right? If you ever put a rook on the b file, then you can recapture with a rook potentially. Keeping these things open is very effective, and it's just one of those moves that I was like, wow, oh, that's really interesting, because normally I keep my queen on d1 when I play the Roy Lopez personally, but this queen e2 is very, very, very interesting, because it's one of those moves that is improving, and isn't just like a waste of time or anything, but it's still waiting for your opponent to make some sort of reply as well. So yeah, I quite like that. B takes c3, b takes c3, and now d5. So this is something I would be personally scared of as white. This is because of my inexperience and inability to play chess well. But let's get into why this would be concerning. So the way I would look at these positions is most of the time I would just take. And then I would be concerned after knight takes knight e4, bishop e7, and bishop to d2, for example. But here, like, f5 looks interesting. But after knight g3, maybe it's fine. But actually rook b2 as well. And there's not really a good reason to ever consider that white is better here because of the activity of this rook, as well as the activity of all of black's pieces. White's pieces are a little bit cramped, and again, this f5 might come. Well, rook takes c2 is currently a threat, and this doesn't look like it's gone white's way. So instead, this move d4 is quite interesting. Despite black looking like they have more activity, well, it's not quite as easy as it might seem. So in a lot of Roy Lopez positions, white takes on slightly less space or slightly passive looking pieces like the bishop on c1 or the bishop on c2, but they end up becoming the star pieces of the game. And this is no exception in this game. They barely move, but they're the best pieces on the board. And, well, where are they facing? It's quite obvious when you just look at the squares they're covering. And these are laser beams. So, okay, after d4, the thing is, again, yeah, taking on d5 is just not really an effective try here. And if you try something like g4 first, it's a bit dubious, because now if you try something like d4, it's just not as good. Because after, for example, takes and queen takes a6, well, you just opened up your king, and yeah, if the position's opening up and you weakened your king, then there's not really a reason for this, despite, you want to take on a6 here after d4. So going back to the game, d4 was played immediately, of course. And this is very effective. So what white's doing is they're going to trade off a few central pawns. And white's going to take this pawn on a6 for it. So it'll end up as equal material at the end of the day. But having that outside pass pawn is very effective and can lead to some very uncomfortable positions for black. So after e takes d4, which is the only reasonable move. The problem is you cannot take on d4, because after knight takes d4, this is just a huge mess, and not something that white would want to go into. And the problem is they can't even really take on a6 comfortably, because c2 is also hanging as well. So yeah, this is absolutely horrendous. Of course, you don't want to do this. So you take on a6, and after taking on a6, well, you have to consider taking on c3, which was played in the game. But after taking on c3, we can actually take on c6, funnily enough. So taking on d2 was played. And, well, that just makes sense, because, of course, you want to make sure you're not just, like, down a piece here. Otherwise, if you move your bishop or something and then white moves their knight away, then, yeah, that's just awful. So c takes d2, and knight takes d2 is played. And we should mention bishop takes d2, because, of course, but the problem with bishop takes d2 is after bishop to a7, then, for example, e takes d5 could be played, but it's just not really that pleasant after bishop takes f3, for example, which damages the king side a bit here, and I'm not really sure if we really want to go into this. For example, queen takes d5 as well, but other things to mention, for example, are like g4. So g4, the thing is here, if we're already looking at this to try to get this pawn off the board, like for example, the idea of g4 is obviously, well, our knight is being threatened to be captured, which is something we want to avoid. But also after the bishop moves, we might want to either push or take on d5. But the fact that, again, we're looking at this is just not a good sign. So there's actually a really nice tactical move here, knight takes e4, which totally works out. And the idea is after you take on h5 here, there's knight takes d2. And all of a sudden, you have to deal with queen g5 check. So black's not actually even losing a piece here. And at the end of the day, well, black is for choice, clearly, because look at white's king side. This is an absolute mess. White does have some counterplay because of this a-pawn, but yeah, objectively, black should be either slightly better or just better here. So this is not good. Going all the way back, even though it's a obvious move, knight takes d2, it still needs to be understood. So it's good to mention it. Bishop d4, rook to a4, which is a nice idea just to get a tempo on the bishop here. And then d takes e4 was played. So bishop to a7 might have been a better try. And the reason why is because there's this funny idea of e takes d5 and bishop to e2. Where after, for example, rook to e1 is bishop to b5. So you can't actually take the d5 pawn, so you're not really worried here. And after bishop a7, then you can consider taking on d4. But after taking on d4 here, the problem is this bishop is just a little vulnerable, and you don't really get enough time to cover it. So here, Svidler ended up playing the move knight takes e4. And of course, if you play bishop to e2 or something here, then taking on f6, for example, or even taking on maybe d4, or even rook to e1, all of these moves look extremely messy. For example, bishop to e2, let's just say rook to e1 here, bishop to b5, doesn't work because at the very least it looks like we have knight takes f6, let's say queen takes f6 and queen to e4, and this bishop should be lost because of the mate on h7 here, so that doesn't work. So of course knight takes e4 was played. And now an interesting choice was played. So my instinct is of course queen takes e4, but after bishop g6, queen takes d4, and bishop takes c2. You don't really want to take on d4. That kind of solves white's mistake a little bit and keeps some sort of edge. But after bishop takes c2, well, it's opposite color bishops, and this is actually not as bad. This might be holdable for black, so definitely something to watch out for here. But that's why bishop takes c4 was played, because now if bishop g6, queens stay on, this a pawn is still really annoying, and there's still good chances. So after bishop takes e4, bishop to e2, and I think this is what Michael Adams missed. There's actually bishop takes h7 in the position, which is very unfortunate. Because the problem is, yeah, if you move away, then bishop to b5 comes, and yeah, I guess you could still play bishop takes h7, but it's just under a bit of a worse circumstances here. So not really something you want to do. Instead, okay, so bishop takes h7, and the idea here is if king takes h7, there's queen e4 check, king g8, and taking on e2, and well, white is actually just up a pawn, and this is a really nice pawn. Another option here is also rook takes d4 first, which actually is probably just a better variation. After queen e8, tricky move, you should probably just play rook e1 to attack the bishop again. Queen takes e4, rook takes e4, bishop d3, and for example, rook d4. And this is actually just lost. Having the outside pass pawn and being down a pawn is just a complete nightmare for black, and there's not really much that can be done. So king to h8 was played, because taking is pretty much just feels like losing by force. Bishop to c2 now was played, and then rook to e8. So rook to e8 makes a lot of sense from a prophylactic perspective, because this move queen e4 is very scary. But actually it turns out bishop takes f1 is a very reasonable choice. Where after queen e4 and f5, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, rook takes d4, and for example bishop to e2. This is probably the best that Michael Adams can get from this position, but it is still actually slightly better for white, despite being down the exchange. They do have a pawn for that, as well as the bishop pair. So if you count the bishop pair as worth an extra point, like you count one bishop as 3 points of material, another bishop as three. But when you have two bishops, then it's like an extra point. So if it's like two bishops versus two knights, you might consider it to be like 7 points of material versus six, just because of your dynamic play that's possible. So up a pawn and having the bishop pair here, you can maybe consider or create an argument that, well, it's actually equal material, which may or may not be true. But having that outside pass pawn again is really annoying and is going to lead to some problems for black. But it's not a winning advantage quite yet. So after bishop to c2, rook to e8, this is a mistake. And it's just simply because rook to e1 is possible. And unfortunately, bishop to b5 does not work because you can take on e8 and take on d4 at the end of the day. So it takes on e8, takes on e8, and takes on d4. And this is just completely winning. I think we can all agree on that. So rook to e6 was played. And that's a very promising move. And Svidler plays something that many probably wouldn't. There are two options that lead to some sort of advantage. And, well, Svidler went for the more interesting one. One of them is rook takes d4, which still leads to a really good play for white here after queen takes c7. This does look very, very scary. But instead, Svidler plays queen takes e6. And the play gets extremely interesting very quickly. So queen takes e6, f takes e6, of course. Rook takes e2. So what we have here is a rook and a bishop, a light squared bishop, against the queen. And, well, this is all actually totally fine play. It's hard to pinpoint any mistakes that either side has made until this very moment. So the only move, and the fact that there's an only move for black in this position might be surprising, but the only move is queen to d6, which is, to be fair, kind of a semi-natural move where it's an improvement, but it has a very specific tactical resource that's extremely necessary. So after queen to d6, my thought was, what if rook e4? And turns out rook e4 is one of those testing moves that happens in a lot of these variations coming up. And the reason why this is okay is because now there's bishop takes f2 check, king takes, and queen c5 check, picking up the c2 bishop. So king g1, or sorry, bishop to e3, taking on c2, king g1, queen d1 check, king h2, and rook to b1, and black actually has just enough counterplay to be fine here. But, of course, queen d6 was not played, e5 was played. And now, all of a sudden, this gives one tempo enough in order to essentially win things. And the reason why is because, well, it's actually the difference in the quality of the a pawn. That's it. So after a6, queen d7 was played, but let's just say queen to d6 was played again. Now, a7, rook a8. And the difference in the quality of the pieces is astronomical right now because, well, hey, if your rook's on a8 instead of on b1, creating some counterplay on the first rank, that makes all the difference. Now rook e4 does work, where after bishop takes f2, king takes, queen c5 check. You can actually go to g3 at the end here, bishop e3, queen takes c2, and king g3. And funnily enough, this is actually just completely winning, despite being down the exchange. So that's concerning. All of a sudden, this no longer works. And because this line no longer works, there isn't a defense for black. And they try their best here. So after a6, queen to d7 was played. Now a7, which is a nice move. Rook to a8. And now, instead of rook to e4, there's a nicer move. And it all has to do with the problem piece that we mentioned earlier. And it's rook takes e5. And just exploiting the poor position of this bishop ends up just completely ruining the game for black, because now after rook takes e5 we have to look at some stuff. For example, bishop takes e5. We have to look at it, otherwise we just lost the rook. Rook h4 check, king g8, bishop b3 check, and the reason why we play this is because we want this square. So king f8, rook h8 check, king e7, rook takes a8, and one thing we have to look at as well is bishop d4, because, well, it attacks the pawn and creates a threat. Of course, we're not scared of queen to d4 here, because we have rook e8 check, and then we promote, so we'd just be up a full bishop there. But we have to look at bishop d4, because if the rook moves away to somewhere a little unimportant, then all of a sudden bishop takes a7, and well, maybe black is still in the game, at least for a little bit. But there's an insane move here, and that's rook to f8. So the idea of rook to f8, of course, is to clear the square for the pawn. And also, the other point is, now you cannot take the pawn in time, because if you do, rook f7 check wins the queen. And that loses the game for black, because they're down a full bishop here. As well as covering f2. So now there's no tricks on taking f2 as well, because you can just take it as well with the rook if you'd like to. So you don't have to worry about any queen d4 check stuff. So completely winning now. All right, so let's go back. So because of this, it wasn't taken. g6 was played, because now rook h5 check isn't played. Of course, if you play anything else, rook h5 check will just finish the game. With a similar variation in mind of these bishop b3s and taking this rook. But the added benefit is that you have an extra rook on a4, which is extra winning. So yeah, g6, rook to e4, similar to the move before that was mentioned of playing rook e1 to e4 when there was still an e pawn on the board. And now c5 in order to protect the bishop. But now, all of a sudden, you're weakening other squares. And now rook a6 is possible. Because, hey, now g6 is weakened all of a sudden. Rook takes a7. Rook takes g6. And there's still actually this mating net. Before, it was more of a net to win the a8 rook because of skewers. But now, rook h4 is a colossal threat. So bishop g7 was played in order to prevent rook h4 from being completely dominating. Rook h4, you can meet it with king to g8 here. And yeah, maybe you can consider something like rook g to g4, but again, that's not what was played. What was played was even better. So right now, white has one piece that could be doing more. The rook on e4 is great. It's threatening both rook h4 and rook e8 stuff, which would lead to some sort of mate. Like, for example, if queen c7, if we just like pass the move and queen c7 is played, then all of a sudden rook e8 check is winning, because king h7, we can end up going like rook c6, for example, winning the queen. So they can't make some sort of very passive move. But we also don't have to wait here. We can play bishop to b2. And bishop to b2 is so nice, because the idea here is if you take, all of a sudden, rook h4, queen h7 takes, rook takes. If king takes, then rook a6 will just win the rook. And if rook takes, then you can just simply go rook to b6. And they're either losing their bishop or the rook on h7. Either way, it's completely winning, because 3 versus 1, even if it's just an exchange up, it's also 2 pawns up as well. So 4 points up, completely winning. All right, so bishop to b2 and bishop takes b2 was not played. Instead, queen b5 was tried. And now, probably my favorite move of the game was played. Queen e2 and taking on e6, all these moves were really nice, but this one just solidifies how bad black's position is, despite being fine material-wise. Bishop to c3. So, like I mentioned with the waiting, it was actually kind of hard to find a waiting move before, but try to find one here. And you might notice you can't, right? So the first thing we have to look at is bishop takes c3. And before we were, getting some stuff and winning the queen. And here it's actually no exception. So after bishop takes c3, there's rook h4 check. Rook h7 is forced. There's no other move because of the g file being covered. Rook takes h7, king takes h7, and rook b6, winning the queen and the game. Being up a full rook and 2 pawns is definitely enough. So, okay, that move doesn't work. So let's look at rook a8, getting off the 7th rank. Of course, this does not work as well. Rook h4 check, king g8, rook takes, king f8, and rook h8. So you need to actually defend the bishop on g7. So rook d7, I thought was an interesting try, but of course this immediately fails as well. To rook takes with discovered check, double check. So you can't take the rook. The rook is also giving a check. King h6, and rook h8 mate. The only other move that I could find that doesn't look like it destroys the position is rook b7. So e8 is still covered. The 7th rank is still covered. And yeah, I thought this was enough. But actually rook e to g4. And now it's another situation of like, okay, you played rook to b7, but now find another move. If you take on c3 again, you end up in the same situation where, well, the bishop can't move because now it's actually just rook g8 mate, so you don't even have to look at anything else. So of course bishop takes c3 is not possible, but then what? And the only reasonable move I could find is rook a7, but this just doesn't work actually. After rook takes on g7, rook takes g7, and rook takes g7, it's just lost. Any move, rook g3 is coming, and it's game over because it's just going to be mate. So queen c4, for example, you just play rook g3, and they have to give up their queen and win the game. And that is why way back when we got to this position after bishop c3, that's why Michael Adams ended up resigning. Absolutely stunning game. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. It was a bit longer, but of course, hey, if it's a game of the year, we got to go into it in depth and look at all of the interesting nuances. So thank you guys for watching. I will see you hopefully next week. I'm hoping to make this a weekly thing, but I'm just going to do it as I'm able to. And we will continue on with the next game of the year. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye.